Okay, so, we love to go deep on all sorts of stuff here. And today we're looking at something pretty intimate.
Yeah, definitely geared towards spicing things up in the bedroom or wherever else you and your partner like to. Well.
Exactly. You shared Melinda Holmes's guide with us. Blow Her Mind, his illustrated guide to orgasmic oral sex. So good shell. Tell her friends about it.
Yeah.
Quite a title.
It is, and it really lays out a roadmap for better cunnilingus and ultimately better sex for both partners.
Right, because, we all know good sex is important in a relationship, but Holmes points out in her intro that a lot of women aren't getting the satisfaction they deserve, particularly if it's mostly intercourse.
Yeah, the whole point of the guide is to help men understand how to really please their partners with oral sex and, create those really amazing experiences.
And she comes at this from an interesting angle, right? She's an erotic fiction writer, so she brings that creativity, but she also draws on all this research, like insights from the adult film industry, physiological studies, and even her own experiences.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique blend of perspectives, and the feedback from readers included in the guide seems really positive.
Yeah, definitely. One reader talked about learning a ton about the female body and sexuality. Another emphasized really knowing your own body in relation to pleasure, and someone even mentioned overcoming past hangups about enjoying sex.
So it's clearly a topic that resonates with people. Okay, so let's get into the guide itself. How does it frame cunnilingus?
Yeah, like where does she even begin?
Well, she starts with the definition, kind of a baseline,
Right.
referencing Wikipedia, which describes cunnilingus as the oral stimulation of the clitoris, vulva, or vagina.
Oh, pretty straightforward.
Right. But she emphasizes right away that for women, it's way more than just a clinical definition. It's about the sensations, the intimacy, the emotional connection.
Makes sense. And she backs that up with some pretty compelling stats, right? Like the guide mentions that only about two-thirds of married women say they really enjoy intercourse,
Yeah.
and even fewer, like around 25%, actually orgasm from it.
Exactly. Those numbers really highlight the potential for something more. And that's where cunnilingus comes in.
So what's the difference in terms of enjoyment?
Well, the guide cites studies showing that over 80% of women find cunnilingus to be the most pleasurable sexual act, and a similar percentage, upwards of 80%, say they consistently experience orgasm from it.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is, and it really highlights how important oral sex can be for a woman's sexual satisfaction.
Okay, so we're seeing that there's a clear preference for cunnilingus over intercourse for a lot of women, but the guide also talks about how porn kind of skews things a bit.
Oh yeah, she makes a good point about how porn tends to focus so heavily on blowjobs and intercourse, which really caters more to the male perspective and doesn't necessarily reflect what women find most pleasurable.
Right, it's almost like the media we're consuming isn't giving us the full picture when it comes to female pleasure.
Exactly, and to illustrate this, she shares an anecdote from a woman named Kathy who describes oral sex as the missing element that completely transformed her relationship.
So it's not just about stats, it's about real women's experiences.
Absolutely. Now, beyond the anecdotal evidence, there's also a fundamental physiological difference at play.
Right. The guide talks about how men's nerve endings are primarily in the penis.
Yeah.
So penetrative sex is inherently pleasurable for them.
Yeah, but for women, the clitoris, which is packed with nerve endings, is often not directly stimulated during intercourse.
And that explains why so many women don't orgasm from intercourse alone,
Exactly, and the guide even points out that you often see female performers in adult films manually stimulating themselves during intercourse scenes.
which kind of proves the point, right? Like penetration alone isn't always enough.
And then she contrasts that with lesbian porn, where cunnilingus is often the main event.
Interesting. Okay, so we've established the importance of cunnilingus from both a preference and a physiological standpoint, but the guide also talks about the right mindset for it.
Absolutely. It's not just about technique. It's about approaching sex as a team sport, where both partners are equally invested in each other's pleasure.
I like that. And there's this really intriguing idea that when a woman orgasms, it can actually increase her desire to please her partner.
Right. It creates this positive feedback loop of mutual satisfaction and intimacy.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics of female orgasm. What does the guide say about that?
Well, first, it reiterates that key stat that most women need direct or indirect clitoral stimulation to orgasm. And it includes this reminder from the Mayo Clinic that orgasms can be super variable from woman to woman.
Right, like what feels good, how intense it is, and how much stimulation is needed can differ a lot.
Exactly. Now, remember how we talked about the clitoris being packed with nerve endings? Well, the guide actually puts a number on it over 8,000, which is more than the penis or almost any other part of the body.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. And
I
that's
don't
why
know.
it's so sensitive and responsive, but also why it's important to be gentle and avoid overstimulation.
So it's all about finding that sweet spot.
Exactly. Now, the guide also touches on the G-spot and the urethral sponge as potential sources of orgasm.
Okay, I've heard of the G-spot, but what's the urethral sponge?
It's this spongy area of tissue surrounding the urethra, and it can be really sensitive for some women.
Interesting. So can you orgasm from stimulating those areas?
Some women can, but the guide suggests that they often produce less intense orgasms compared to the clitoris. However, when you combine stimulation of these areas with clitoral stimulation, things can get pretty amazing.
Got it. Hitting multiple pleasure centers at once.
Exactly. Now, there's this great anecdote in the guide from a woman named Elizabeth who had this mind-blowing experience with a female partner who really knew what she was doing, and then she shared what she learned with her husband, who became much better at pleasuring her.
That's awesome. It really shows the power of communication and being open to learning new things.
Absolutely. And speaking of learning new things, the guide also talks about the concept of multiple orgasms for women.
Really? So women can have multiple orgasms?
Potentially, yes. The guide cites Masters and Johnson, who found that if a woman remains aroused after an orgasm and receives further stimulation before her arousal levels drop too much, she can often experience another orgasm, and potentially even more.
So it's about keeping that momentum going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that we've got a good understanding of the female orgasm, let's get into the anatomy. The guide calls it the anatomical pleasure chest.
Okay, I like that. So what are the key areas we should know about?
Well, it starts with the mons pubis, but it's sometimes called the hill of Venus. It's that fleshy area above the clitoris.
Okay, and what about it?
While it's not a primary source of sensation, it's part of the overall landscape, kind of sets the stage.
Right, then what?
Then there's the front commissure, which is just below the mons pubis where the clitoral shaft begins.
Okay, and what's special about that area?
Well, the guide mentions that for some women, stroking this area can actually be more pleasurable than direct contact with the clitoris itself.
Interesting. So it's about paying attention to those nuances.
Exactly. Now, moving on to the clitoral shaft, this is the part of the clitoris that lies beneath the skin, and it can be very responsive to gentle pressure and touch.
So it's not just about the tip.
Right. And then we have the clitoral hood, which is super important
Why is that?
because it protects the clitoris, and direct stimulation of the clitoris itself can sometimes be too intense. Especially initially, the guide suggests focusing on the hood with downward strokes or gentle circles.
I see. So kind of indirectly stimulating the clitoris.
Exactly. And as a woman gets aroused, the hood naturally retracts, exposing the clitoris for more direct stimulation later on.
Got it. Okay, so then we get to the clitoris itself, the main attraction.
Right. And the guide really hammers home the point that this is the epicenter of female pleasure because of all those nerve endings.
Okay, so what's the best way to stimulate it?
Well, that can vary from woman to woman, but the key is to be gentle, sensitive, and pay attention to her reactions.
Right, avoid going in like a jackhammer.
Exactly. Now, moving down a bit, we have the frenulum, which is that small area of tissue where the labia meet just below the clitoris.
Okay, and what about that?
It also has nerve endings and can be stimulated with gentle massage or licking.
Okay, so another sensitive spot.
Yeah, and then there are the labia minora and majora, or the inner and outer lips.
Right, I know those.
They can be pleasurable when licked, kissed, and caressed, although they're generally less sensitive than the clitoris.
Okay, so part of the overall experience.
Exactly. Then we have the vaginal opening, and the guide points out the G-spot, which is located inside the vagina on the front wall.
Right, the elusive G-spot.
Exactly. For many women, stimulating the G-spot can lead to really intense orgasms.
Okay. And then there's the fourchette, right? That's
Yeah.
at the bottom of the vaginal opening.
Yes, it's similar to the frenulum in terms of sensitivity, and it might be especially sensitive for women who've had an episiotomy during childbirth.
Okay, good to know. And finally, we have the perineum, which is the area between the fourchette and the anus.
Right, this can be an erogenous zone for some women, but the guide stresses the need for communication here, because some women might be uncomfortable with stimulation in that area.
Makes sense. So we've covered the entire vulva. Now, what about other erogenous zones?
Oh yeah, the guide has a whole section on that. It goes beyond the genitals to include areas like the hair, neck, ears, lips, breasts, armpits.
Wait, hold on. The armpits, really?
Yeah, for some people, it can be a turn-on.
Huh. Learn something new every day.
Okay.
So what else is on the list?
Well, there's also the stomach. The guide notes that it could be sensitive for some. Then there's the spine, the buttocks, the legs, especially the inner thighs, and behind the knees, the feet. And of course, we already mentioned the internal G-spot.
Wow, that's quite a list.
It is, and the guide gives specific examples for some of these areas, like running your fingers through her hair, kissing and licking her neck, whispering in her ear, things like that.
Okay, so it's really about creating a whole body sensual experience.
Exactly, and it emphasizes that foreplay isn't just about what happens right before penetration, but rather a more holistic approach to arousal.
I like that. Okay, so we've explored the anatomy and some of the other erogenous zones now. Like, let's talk about preparation. What does the guide say about getting ready?
Well, first and foremost, cleanliness is key for both partners.
Right. Good hygiene is always a must.
Absolutely. The doll delves into the topic of hair removal, acknowledging that preferences vary, but noting a general trend toward less pubic hair for cunnilingus.
Okay, so like a Brazilian wax?
Yeah, that's one option. But it also discusses other methods like shaving laser hair removal and depilatory creams. The important thing is respecting your partner's preferences and making sure she's comfortable.
Right. It's her body, her choice.
Exactly. And for the guys, the guide stresses the importance of a clean shave beforehand because stubble can be really irritating on the vulva.
Makes sense. Okay, so what about more sensitive topics like oral sex during menstruation?
The guide calls it earning your Red Wings.
Uh-huh.
Well, presents it as a personal choice for both partners. Some couples are fine with it, others aren't. If you are going to do it using a tampon, can minimize the mess. But the key is open communication.
Right, make sure everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. Now, the guide also addresses STDs. Even though cunnilingus is considered lower risk than unprotected vaginal or anal sex, there's still a potential for transmission if there are any open sores or bleeding gums.
So it's still important to be mindful.
Yeah, it mentions using latex barriers like dental dams or even improvising with condoms or plastic wrap to
Yep.
create a barrier.
Okay, good to know. Anything else in the preparation section?
Yeah, one really important warning is against blowing air into the vagina.
Why is that?
It can create an air embolism, which can be really dangerous, even fatal.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah, the guide clarifies that this is different from vaginal farts or queefs, which are totally normal.
Okay, so no blowing air, but queefs are fine.
Exactly. Finally, the guide
Okay.
talks about hygiene products. It advises against using harsh antibacterial or alkaline soaps in the vaginal area because they can disrupt the natural pH balance.
So what should you use?
Gentle, fragrance-free products specifically designed for feminine hygiene. It also recommends washing daily from front to back and wearing cotton underwear, and it strongly advises against douching.
Okay, so all about maintaining a healthy vaginal environment.
Exactly. All right, so we're all prepped and ready. Now, let's get to the good stuff, the techniques.
Yeah, let's dive into the doing it right section.
Okay, so the guide starts by acknowledging that men and women often experience and approach foreplay differently. Well, it suggests that men are more visually and physically oriented in their arousal, while women tend to be more responsive to emotional connection, interaction,
Yeah.
and the buildup of anticipation.
Interesting. So it's more about setting the mood and creating a connection.
Exactly. And the guide makes this interesting point that for many women, foreplay as a separate prelude might not even be the best way to think about it.
So it's more of a continuous flow.
Right. The entire process of intimacy, including kissing, touching, and oral sex itself, can be pleasurable and contribute to arousal. In fact, for many women, cunnilingus is the big O.
I like that. So what are some of the techniques described in the guide?
Well, the first one is called flutter of angel wings, and it involves starting at either the head or the feet and slowly moving down or up the body, showering your partner with kisses and caresses along the way.
Sounds sensual.
The idea is to build anticipation before focusing on the genitals.
Okay, what else?
There's the snake charmer, which involves gentle kissing and brief teasing licks inside the labia and around the vulva.
Okay, so starting to explore the area.
Exactly. Then there's the Venus butterfly, which is described as light, quick, woodpecker-like thrusts of a slightly stiffened tongue inside the wet vagina.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the guide suggests varying the placement and paying attention to her responses.
Okay, so more focused on internal stimulation.
Right. Then we have passion sauvage, which involves gently sucking on the vulva, avoiding the clitoris initially, and using soft tongue touches.
Okay, and why is that?
The guide highlights the intimacy of this technique and the potential arousal that can come from tasting her natural fluids.
Interesting. Okay, what else?
There's Sadie Hawkins' Revenge, where you fold your tongue into a tube and use it to gently fuck her clitoris.
Haha. Okay, that one sounds playful.
The name kind of plays on the idea of a role reversal and encourages a verbalization of pleasure.
Got it. What else is on the list?
Well, there's Love Letters, which involves using the tip of your tongue to trace imaginary letters on the inner surfaces of the vulva.
Okay, that sounds fun and unpredictable.
Then there's Ascend into Heaven, which is teasingly licking up and down the labial slit. You can also incorporate finger stimulation with this one.
Okay, so kind of combining techniques.
Exactly. And the guide mentions variations like flicking the clitoris or using a back-and-forth sewing motion with the tongue.
Okay, cool. What else?
There's nosy, 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 which is a bit more unusual. It involves stimulating the clitoris with your nose while licking the vulva with your tongue.
Oh, wow, that's different.
Yeah, it's about combining different types of touch and pressure.
Got it. Okay, what else is on the list?
There's lip-locking the nanny, which focuses on using only your moist lips to kiss and suck on the vulva and clitoris.
So more about expressing passion than just the licking itself.
Right, then there's the insolent tongue, which is about gently teasing and torturing the clitoris with soft, moist licks, deliberately avoiding direct stimulation until she's highly aroused, and then switching to a feathery touch as she approaches orgasm.
Okay, so building up the tension.
Exactly. Then we have tempest in a teapot, which is a rhythmic sweeping motion of the tongue back and forth across the clitoral hood.
Okay, and what's the key to that one?
Starting slowly and varying the speed and pressure, the guide also cautions against upward strokes directly on the clitoris.
Okay, good to know. Then there's spiraling into pleasure, right?
Yes, that one involves swirling your tongue around the clitoris, but again, initially avoiding direct contact with the most sensitive spot.
Got it. So building up to the direct stimulation.
Exactly. Then there's sucking it up,
Yeah.
which involves gently taking the clitoris into your mouth and applying rhythmic suction.
Okay, and when's the best time to try that one?
Once she's already pretty aroused.
Okay, good to know. What else?
There's Whirlpool of Desire, which is a more immersive technique where you place your face flat against her vulva and use your tongue and lips to caress and lap up her natural fluids.
Okay, and what about using your hands while you're doing all this?
Yeah, the guide definitely encourages combining hand use with cunnilingus while your mouth is busy externally. You can gently explore inside the vagina with your fingers. Maybe focus on the G-spot.
Okay, so simultaneous stimulation.
Exactly. Just make sure your fingers are wet clean and you don't have any rings or long nails that could cause discomfort.
Right, safety and hygiene first.
Absolutely. And speaking of the G-spot, the guide revisits it, explaining its location and suggesting gentle stroking or pressure, often combined with clitoral stimulation for a really intense orgasm.
Okay, so really targeting that spot.
Yeah, and finally, the guide briefly touches on using toys like vibrators and dildos.
Okay, so incorporating some extra fun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It can be a great way to enhance things, especially if you're an established couple or if she already enjoys using them on her own.
Awesome. Okay, so we've covered the techniques now. What about positions?
Oh yeah, the guide has a whole section on that. It emphasizes the importance of variety to keep things fresh and exciting.
Makes sense. So what are some of the positions described?
Well, there's the traditional position with the woman on her back and legs up. It offers easy access, but can be tough on the neck for the giver.
Yeah, I can see that.
There are variations like having her put her feet on your back or shoulders for a more intimate feel, or bringing her legs up towards her breasts, which can expose the anus. The guide cautions about the order of licking if you're exploring both areas.
Right, wouldn't want to go from the anus to the clitoris.
Uh-huh. Exactly. Then there's the cliff's edge where the woman is still on her back but with her legs flat.
Okay, so what's the difference?
It gives her more control over the angle and depth, but can be even harder on the giver's neck.
Got it. Then there's Soixante Neuf, right, or 69.
Yeah, that's the head-to-crotch classic. The guide describes it as comfortable and fun and mentions variations like side-by-side woman on top, man on top.
Okay, so lots of options.
Right. It does note that it can be tricky to focus when you're both potentially orgasming and suggests facing her feet initially to avoid direct clitoral stimulation.
Okay, so building up to the main event.
Exactly. Then there's taking her from the rear, which is similar to doggy style.
Okay, and what's the benefit of that position?
It can create a submissive feel for the woman, and it allows the giver to easily access the clitoris and vagina.
Okay, then there's SOMF, right? Sit on my face.
Uh-huh. Yes. That one puts the woman in complete control. It can be a submissive experience for the man, but the guide stresses communication and caution to avoid suffocation.
Right. Definitely don't want any accidents.
Exactly. There's also a reverse cowgirl variation where she's facing away.
Okay, what else?
There's the kneeling position where the woman is on her back at the edge of the bed and the man is kneeling on the floor. It can be a bit awkward for the woman's legs, though.
Okay, then there's soaring through the azure, which sounds pretty exotic.
It involves the woman's legs up on the bed, the man's arms caressing her breasts, maybe a finger in her mouth, and his tongue on her vagina. It requires some coordination, though.
Uh-huh. I can imagine then there's dominatrix, right?
Yes. That one has the woman leaning against a wall or standing with one foot raised while the man kneels before her. The guide suggests it can be very empowering for the woman.
Okay, so it's about taking charge.
Exactly. There's even a coat room scenario mentioned as a variation.
Okay. Spicy. Then there's the doctor is einen, right?
Yes, that one humorously describes the gynecological exam position with the tongue as the speculum. It's presented as a more kinky option.
Definitely adventurous. Okay. And last but not least, we have the circus tent.
Yes, that one involves the woman on her stomach with her legs draped over the man's shoulders as he rises. It's considered high risk, though potential for injury and headache.
So maybe not for everyone.
Haha. Probably best to stick with the other positions.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered techniques and positions now. The guide wraps up with some important warnings and common problems.
Yeah, let's go over those.
First up is dry vagina, which is apparently quite common and can be caused by things like hormones, stress medications, not necessarily a lack of interest.
Okay, so what can you do about it?
The guide suggests staying hydrated, eating foods like soy, using water-based lubricants, and allowing for natural moisturizing during cunnilingus.
So lots of options.
Exactly. Then it addresses vaginal farts or queefs. It reassures readers that they're normal, just air escaping from the vagina.
So no need to be embarrassed.
Nope, just avoid making jokes about it. It also mentions that rarely it could be a sign of a fistula and suggests Kegel exercises for strengthening the pelvic floor muscles.
Okay, good to know. Now, what about women faking orgasms?
Yeah, the guide tackles that sensitive topic. It points out that many women don't always orgasm during sex, often due to insufficient stimulation.
So it's not always intentional.
Right. The key is open and honest communication without judgment. The guide encourages creating a safe space where your partner feels comfortable expressing what they like and don't like.
Makes sense. And what about women who have difficulty orgasming at all?
The guide addresses that too. It's called anorgasmia, and it emphasizes the need for sympathy and a non-judgmental approach. It suggests trying to replicate conditions and techniques that might lead to orgasm during masturbation, and even exploring self-stimulation together. If the issue persists, it recommends seeing a sex therapist.
Okay, so seeking professional help if needed.
Exactly. Finally, the guide touches on the delicate topic of a sexually traumatized partner.
Okay, so what does it say about that?
It stresses the importance of support, trust, communication, and encouraging professional help if they haven't already sought it.
Right, because trauma can have a huge impact on someone's sexuality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so to wrap up, this guide is a pretty comprehensive look at cunnilingus.
It really is. It covers everything from anatomy and techniques to positions and potential problems.
And it highlights the importance of understanding female pleasure and prioritizing open communication with your partner.
Yeah, it's not just about the mechanics, it's about the connection and the intimacy.
Exactly. And the guide playfully concludes by mentioning the enjoyment of the taste of pussy. But maybe the real takeaway from our deep dive today is that true mastery of cunnilingus comes from understanding the emotional and physical nuances we've discussed.
Absolutely. It's about going beyond just the act itself and really connecting with your partner on a deeper level.
Exactly. And that's something to think about. How can this knowledge enrich your relationships and lead to more profound intimacy and shared pleasure?
Food for thought, for sure. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
Anytime.
Until next time.